Hi everyone, I'm Gordon Burkell at Filmmaker U. FilmmakerU.com. We create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can check them out at FilmmakerU.com. Every week we talk to a film professional to chat and give you a chance to join us and ask questions. Today I'm joined by Wyatt Smith, ACE, editor of Doctor Strange, Into the Woods, Mary Poppins, and he's currently working on The Little Mermaid. Welcome to the show, Wyatt.
Thank you, Gordon. Pleasure to be here.
I guess my first question is how do you like to choose your scripts? Because you've worked on some of these amazing projects, but then you also work on smaller projects like Nine. I think Nine is like a great example of, I don't know if that was indie, but it was a great smaller film.
It was an indie vibe with a very star-studded cast and a very big budget. Well, the interesting thing about Nine is that was my break into film.
Mm-hmm.
And I got that because I mostly worked in music, and that's how I met Rob Marshall. And so I was originally meant to work on the musical numbers, and then it just evolved into me co-editing the film, and that was incredible with Claire Simpson. So in terms of the choice there, it was the opportunity there was what won out, for sure. The interesting thing is, I have a relationship with this director now 14, 15 years on from when we first worked together. And so yeah, it's always interesting to see what his choices and his decisions are, but to be part of his filmmaking team is not something I want to miss. I've learned so much with them. We all have such a shorthand with each other. And there's tremendous benefit to filmmaking to stay with that. So there's the films that I'm fortunate to work on with Rob, which thankfully we haven't fallen out of sync on projects, and that's maintained. But then there's also just wanting diversity in your career. You look at a film like Harriet, with which I did cut for Casey Lemons, and we had just finished Mary Poppins Returns, or I was finishing it, and Rob and I were already talking about The Little Mermaid. I'm like, okay, so this is a huge Disney musical going into a huge Disney musical. I need to move a completely different muscle creatively, challenge myself in a completely different way. So, a relatively small budget, slave narrative biopic seemed about as far away from Mary Poppins as I could get. Excuse me. So some of that is that choice, is not wanting to just keep repeating. I mean, like actors, editors get typecast for the types of films that they do. At the same time, like a great comedy editor, you should be cutting comedy. It's such a gift. Like, why would you go cut a dramatic film when you can cut comedy? It's so hard. But for me, coming from music originally, I don't want to just cut musicals. Now, there's a lot of challenges to cutting musicals. There's a lot of unspoken rules and things that it's great that I have that knowledge, but I want to round out that knowledge. I want to have a longer career. I want to look back on a variety of films, because I don't just go to the theater to watch musicals. I watch everything. I had this conversation with Jonathan Demme a bunch of years back. He was I had to interview with him, I think, 3 times for Ricky and the Flash, and it was music based, but obviously coming out of something like, coming out of these big Disney type projects. I had done Pirates at that point. I'd done the second 300 film. He's like, why on earth would I hire you? And I'm like, well, I watch every type of movie. Why can't I work on every type of movie?
Yeah.
So picking scripts becomes a combination of that process.
Well, and you said there were some unspoken rules to working on musicals. Are you able to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's nothing natural about musicals. We're talking right now. I'm not singing to you. Okay. Yeah. The whole nature of a musical is we're singing to each other. And so how you get in and out of songs, how you earn songs is, I guess, the way we talk about it. There's a big challenge to that, how you can kind of tee something up so it's not like, oh, I hear the music, here comes the song, so that it can flow naturally out of the dialogue. The other thing is narratively, if you have a scene saying something and the lyrics of your song or the music is conveying the same thing, you got to cut the scene out. You know, you never want a scene that says the same thing as a song. You never want to double that up. So sometimes you're cutting songs down, or you're interweaving, exchanging scenes and songs so that it makes a complete thought. But what you never want to do is duplicate the thought of a scene in a song. And when I also say earning a song, part of it is, you know, of course, the composers are key, but when you're editing the film, you're also thinking about how you're seeding musical themes and motifs more than you would with even just like, oh, it's the bad guy, we have the bad guy theme. You're trying to figure out where you can have those suggestions of music so that by the time they get to their song, it's a heightened emotional experience because you've kind of seeded these little musical notions along the way, which is part of the storytelling that an editor would do, even though it's also partly what the music editors and of course the composers are doing, but you're really having a hand in that because ultimately you can get to a much higher place from a song, and it can be more memorable and be more lasting. But also at the same time, since it's so unusual when somebody bursts out singing, if I've planted that music in your head and you're like, oh, I know this song, oh, there's words to this song, it makes it a lot more natural when someone starts singing. So I think those are some of the things I've learned over the years on musicals.
And so how do you judge rushes in a musical? Like, how does that, like, does it change? Because there's usually it's playback or something like that. Like, how are you sort of assessing that, or how is it different than assessing regular rushes or dailies?
I guess the fundamental is it isn't different. You know, the interesting thing about editing is it's so much opinion and taste and instinct. You watch an actor and you're just trying to believe them. Are they that person? Do I believe that they know what they're saying and they believe what they're saying? And it's the same thing with a song lyric. You're staring into their eyes and you know, is it real? Is it credible? Yeah, sometimes it can be mechanical if there's a choreography to it, and are they even getting it? Or, of course, you know, when you're dealing with playback, which is often the case just because of the environments of filmmaking. If somebody's singing and they're in the middle of a storm, it's not going to be a live vocal. You know, there's no way you're ever going to be able to record it with the wind machines and all this type of stuff. So there is also just the basics of things like sync, but otherwise it really is looking into an actor's eyes and just, you know, do I believe you and do you believe you? And that's something that's not really taught. And the interesting thing is, you know, editors all have different tastes, but there's a general consensus on what a good performance is. But at the same time, there's no rule to it. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, you know, you can study acting and get more into the mindset of what the process of an actor is, or watch what a director is looking for and things like that. But it still is very instinctual.
Now, you said you like to try and diversify your work, and I noticed on your resume or on your IMDb you have One Direction, This Is Us documentary.
Right.
I'm assuming that was part of your, like, I haven't done a documentary, or I've worked on a few. What were the challenges that presented to you that got you
The
excited?
interesting thing is it was less the documentary part. Pierre Takal, who I've known for years from back in my music days, he was editing the doc part. I came in to edit the concert. Which I cut with Guy Harding and the concert segments. I mean, Morgan Spurlock was directing the documentary and Paul Dugdale was directing the concert. So I was more brought in to help cut the concert footage because it was a lot of cameras, and also that's what I was doing before my break into film. You know, from the late 90s, you know, I'd been working on music videos and music docs and things like that, but cutting multi-camera concerts is just something I always loved to do, and was really the core of my work for, you know, 15 to 20 years. I'd started to direct multi-camera live music and events and things like that. So that's just kind of what I was known for in New York. And, you know, that film, that documentary, as you can imagine, just had an unbelievable amount of footage, including the concert footage. It's a lot of cameras, a whole lot of shows and everything like that. So it had just kind of gotten to a place where it's like, okay, we need all hands on deck. It was fun to get a call from Morgan. It was great to catch up with Pierre and Guy and meet Paul Dugdale and all that and be part of that show. But yeah, it was strictly because that's what my experience used to be, and it was fun to dive back into it. I love, that type of, it's still storytelling. There's still a lyric, even if it's kind of sugary pop music. No disrespect to 1D. There's a lot of songs I still have on my phone, but but it's a lot of fun to cut concerts and that energy. And like a film, you're trying to think of who you're making it for. In which case, I'm watching these segments of the documentary and I'm looking at the fan base who they're making that whole film for. And it's like, okay, I know exactly how we're going to deliver that visually as a concert, in terms of the cutting, who we're going to see when, what little extras and things are more exciting for an audience when the audience wants to feel themselves in a song, watching a song, and thinking of all that arc while cutting.
Is there a project or a type of film that you're interested in cutting?
Space movie. Space movie. I've never cut a space.
Is that the generic Star Wars?
Anything Star Wars. Oh my God. But I love science fiction. I've always wanted to cut something set in space. Now, admitted, Doctor Strange was, that was Candyland, and it's the multiverse and all of that. And I'm a diehard Marvel comic collector as a kid, and so everything about that was heaven for me. But yeah, like, any kind of space movie. It could range from the crazy like a Spaceballs to the scary like an Alien to the thrillery like an Outland, like to the bizarre. I don't care. Just put me in space.
Which was your favorite Marvel line that you collected as comics?
There were many, but I mean, I have every single appearance of the Silver Surfer from his introduction in the 60s until 1991 when I kind of stopped collecting comics. I have every single appearance. Like,
that's crazy.
I lived for that character.
Yeah.
So much X-Men. I mean, plenty of Doctor Strange. I mean, there was a lot in there. Fantastic Four, so much Fantastic Four. It also followed writers and artists like Walt Simonson.
Yeah. It
was great to work on Thor: The Dark World because that was pulling from Walt Simonson's era of Thor comics, and I have every one of those. Wow. And to this day, I still break down and buy some stuff. But it takes up space. So in New York, not so much anymore.
Yeah, can't have all those white boxes full of comics in New York.
Mm-hmm.
What did you ever get into Image Comics at all?
Somewhat, and yeah, there were definitely imprints I got into. There's far more now than there was when I was collecting. I mean, they were starting to come up in the 80s. I mean, I was collecting things like Dark Horse and things when they were first starting to arrive and stuff like that. But like I said, I got out of comic collecting in the very early 90s. And from there, that's when it really splintered out. So
well, yeah,
a lot of
it's like just before Superman died. You're like, I'm out.
Yeah, I have those comics. I don't think I ever opened or read them. I think that was part of the problem is I got into the collecting aspect of them, and I realized I was getting further and further away from the reading and enjoyment aspect. So I just stopped.
Yeah, it's when you become obsessed with like it has to be in this plastic and in this with this board and everything.
Or they start releasing 10 variant covers of everything, and you have to get the 10 covers. And I'm like, but why do I need the 10 covers? Is there anything good behind the cover?
Yeah.
And there certainly were still some great comics going, but it broke my heart to stop reading things like Sandman and stuff like that. I loved that.
Sandman's a great one.
Which I saw the casting announcement today. That's pretty exciting. So.
Oh, anything in particular stand out?
It's more just to see what characters they plan on using and all that. And the fact that it's even just happening, it's going to be interesting.
Is that, because I remember like, if I'm not mistaken, that was one of the comic series that people were like, it's unfilmable. Am I mistaken in that?
It certainly felt that way.
Yeah.
But I mean, but that was what we were saying, dare I say, nearly 30 years ago. You know, times have
Yeah,
changed.
that's
We've,
true.
you know, I mean, that was the crazy thing about seeing Avengers is it's like, yeah, there'd been some comic book things and stuff like that, but it wasn't until that first Avengers film that I finally was like, oh my God, like they figured out how to make this visually happen and convince me, you know? And then ever since then, now there's an awful lot of comic movies.
Well, one of the things I've noticed in the comic movies is that they amalgamate storylines,
Yeah.
and as someone who's read all the comics, was that like something that was beneficial to you in the cutting room because you're like, okay, I know these storylines, I know this one comes from here, or is that?
It is and it isn't. I mean, when you're talking about Marvel Studios and the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Kevin Feige and you know, he knows all these comic book storylines backwards and forwards. But he's always got a bigger picture. So you have to divorce yourself from that stuff and trust in where things are going to go. At the same time, I do often find myself being like, well, the reason they're even making this is because this character was all about this. So if you remove that, like you're reinventing it. And unfortunately, a lot of the non-Marvel Studios branded Marvel comic films, that's what they're guilty of. You know, as everybody says, it's like, you know, the merc with the mouth, Deadpool, let's make him mute. You know, it's like, these are bad ideas, you know, yeah. And they correct those things. And then you realize like, oh, this was successful because he is an obnoxious, nonstop talking thing like me right now. And so yeah, you keep some of that lore in, and but you have to go with, you know, a whole new visual creation of it, because you know what, it's always been on the page and it's never been real. And all of a sudden it has that next step of realness on top of the fact that it's like, I can have, you know, 20, 30 years of a storyline and story character development in my head, yet this is the first time people are experiencing it and you have 2 hours. So how much are you really going to geek out in there and go too deep in a way that people don't care? They're just looking for the base introduction and that emotion. At the same time, there's all sorts of little Easter eggy type things that you can, you know, chuck into the background of a previs or mention, and suddenly they slip their way in and you get your little comic touch on it.
Well, that's, I think, what's so smart about Marvel is it's like, here's the individual films about these people to introduce them, and then we're going to bring them together and slowly assemble them. So like you get these multiple stories, and it's almost like they're doing the comics again visually, and taking us through that whole journey of crossovers and having to hunt down,
I mean, there's just an incredible plan and foresight there and commitment to a long-term vision. And I mean, it's like, even now seeing all these series, it's you know, even you know, I don't want to know anything about them. Not that, you know, when you're not working on a Marvel film, you're not exactly going to hear about what any of them are doing. You know, you can get vague senses of things, but I also don't want to know. I want to watch them as a fan. But I know in every one of those, they're going to collect somewhere, you know, and it might be the most random little piece is suddenly going to become the most important piece in something else. And that's part of the thrill of watching. And it's very unique what they've created in that sense. You watch it in such a different lens.
Now, when you're working on such a large project, is there something that young editors should know about working on such big projects that they wouldn't be aware of coming out of school or just getting their start on indies right now?
It's a great question. You know, the interesting thing about the big films versus the small films is the big films, you have a lot of resources. You have access to a lot more things. And I don't mean things that like, I want this piece of gear or, you know, whatever, something like that. It's just, there's a lot of people. The departments are huge. So a lot of it, I would say, is, you know, you have to learn to communicate quickly. Know the things that are in your world, where if people knew some of the information you knew, how could it help them in their job? And start to make those introductions around. Likewise, you know, COVID has been a tough thing for many reasons, of course, but, you know, I'm always encouraging my assistants and my team to intermingle with set Not unnecessarily, but just to start to know people and meet people more, because what ends up happening is you start to create this whole communication process, and you really start to dial in, and like one of the things that's great is, for me, it's enabled me to start to learn a lot of the languages and the tools of production designers and art directors and costumers and stunt teams and all these things, so that when I see things or I'm curious about things and I have questions, it's so much easier to get information. And all that information ultimately makes either the filmmaking process better or the movie better, generally both. And that's the interesting thing about a big film, is because when you come onto it, not having done it before, is it just seems so overwhelming. From an editorial standpoint, as an editor, the job is the same. It doesn't matter if the movie is $5 or $300 million. You know, as I've said in the past, it's find the story, get the best performances to tell it, and get people out of the theater. And that is its story, performance, and pace. And that's true of anything big. That's true of anything small. It's true of a music video. It's true of a documentary. You know, it's never rely on spectacle, because if the spectacle is the thing you're focused on or the thing that's making it watchable, it's not really watchable. People need a story, and they need credible performances telling that story. The interesting thing about the small films is I find them 1,000 times more stressful than the big films, because you don't have all those resources. Well, like Harriet would be an interesting example, which is by no means a small film, but what was it, $17, $20 million or something like that. I mean, it's not huge, but it's not tiny. It's, but the fact is, yeah, I'm not on set while they're filming. I don't have that access and communication. I'm getting footage in a void. And as an editor, of course, I can do my job. That's the basis of it, is I get footage, but I'm not able to ask questions. I don't have easy access to talk to maybe a second unit team that's picking something up and reviewing a cut, or even just easy access to a director and things like that. That's just a very quick example of like a film that can't, just it's so natural on a huge film. Of course, I'm going to be wherever they go. I just told you we're about to go on location for 4 weeks. I'm going to be on location. It's that type of thing. So, you know, the smaller films I can find can be a lot more stressful, because people tend to have to take on multiple jobs, as opposed to there being every single person who could ever possibly be needed to do something is just there all the time and right at your fingertips. So the experiences of big films and small films are very different. But I will say, if you're stepping into it for the first time, don't close the door and don't be shy. You know, obviously you don't want to give up the film and show everybody the cuts and all that type of stuff. But at the same time, the more you can communicate with the people there, you're all going to feel part of it. You're going to learn more. It's going to influence your decisions in all different ways. Mm-hmm. You know, if you understand things that are important to a costumer or a hairdresser, of course, it's not going to determine exactly what takes the take, but sometimes when you're hemming and hawing things, you can start to look at all the little details and see what is the most real.
Yeah. So I guess I have one last question I like to ask everyone during the pandemic here. You know, a lot of people have been locked inside because of the pandemic, or a lot of people have been sort of stuck inside, and because of that, streaming has boomed and become very successful. Not that it wasn't successful before, but it's expanded. Yeah. Is there a show during this pandemic or a movie that you discovered on streaming services that you think people should check out?
Well, the interesting thing was how much more I watch series. I tend to, I mean, I watch endless movies, but episodic has never been as big a draw for me. The writing style, I like stories to have that kind of, I know when it's going to start and I know when it's going to end. So the interesting thing was watching so many series. The interesting thing of like Watchmen was one. I mean, that was earlier in the pandemic, and I watched that several times. I mean, it just mind-blowingly, it just had its it had its finger on the pulse of so much of what was happening in society and is still happening in society. It was like prescient. But at the same time, it was also taking a comic series I loved, where, you know, which had been adapted into a film, in many ways successfully for me. But the concept that was going to be expanded and continued, I was like, that just seems like such an odd idea.
Yeah,
but man, they really crushed on that. Another, again, sticking into the earlier in the pandemic, the sci-fi was just really doing so well. Devs was a fantastic series, which was, it was kind of Alex Garland's companion piece to Ex Machina. And a lot of interesting questions asked in that. And again, all these things can be divisive, but I loved talking about these shows with friends. They all had different, such interesting questions and perspectives on it.
Now, you said you really like space, and I'm hesitant to recommend this because I don't know the type of sci-fi that you're into. But have you seen Stowaway?
I did watch Stowaway.
Yeah, it came. Yeah, what'd you think of that?
Yeah, the Anna Kendrick film. It was good. I mean, I have questions about it, but I liked it. I definitely liked it. It was different enough, and it also, we're in this era of very credible near future space movies.
I know.
And there's something also exciting about that. I mean, Ad Astra was very much that. Like the whole process of how he went from Earth to the moon to Mars, all the way out to Jupiter, like all those steps, they felt so like, oh, this is exactly how we're going to do this, because we're really not that far away from it. And what I loved about Stowaway, other than the fact that there is this massive conceit of like, how did this guy end up on this ship, is still, that's a little bit of a vague question mark. But obviously it's more interesting for them, for the whole crux of it, of them dealing with it, with the fact that he is there. But I loved how near future real it was. Like this is going to be, that storyline is going to be happening very soon, as opposed to in a galaxy far away.
Well, what's interesting is it's based off of very roughly based off of a short story from the 50s. And apparently that one is more, because that one's way more sci-fi, like 50s sci-fi almost. So like a guy's flying his ship to Mars and a girl stowaways on it to get to Mars for something else. So it's a little more like written in the 50s, whereas they were like, well, let's make this more realistic and less space sci-fi. And it was fascinating.
And it also just, space problem solving movies are fantastic, just because it does ultimately come down to like resourcefulness and human spirit. And it's like The Martian. The great thing about The Martian is the, what does he say? I'm gonna science the shit out of this. Like, that's the best part of the movie. It's so fun to see somebody like, okay, your life is on the line, what are you gonna do? You have, your option is to die, so you might as well risk it all. And Stowaway ultimately goes there, and so I enjoy that.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy is, because I read a whole article on it, and I guess NASA and like all the space agencies have protocols, and the protocol is you jettison the stowaway.
and that becomes the moral debate. It's you see it in movies all the time. We're all going to die, or is this one person going to die?
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for letting me interview.
It's great to see you again, Gordon.
Yeah, great to see you again. Well, I have a lot of fun in London, as much as you can while being locked.
Yes, in my last few London days, I'll enjoy it. The weather's finally nice now that we're leaving. Yes, it's going to be a while, but it's going to be special. It's different. Rob has a beautiful approach to it, and how do you make it real is the thing we're trying to figure out every day.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you later.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.